dear friends, I've been asked to speak about Century of Light, which is this book. I don't know whether you've all read it yet. It's not the easiest of books to read, but I think it's very important for Baha'is to read so that we understand more clearly what happened in the 20th century and can also get a clearer idea of what is before us in the 21st century. It begins with, I'll start off with two things. I want to read the foreword, which is by the House of Justice, and then the little introduction to give you a basic idea of what the book's about. The rest of the book, of course, isn't by the House of Justice. It's written for the House of Justice. And the House of Justice read it very carefully in session and out of session and went through it before it recommended to the friends to read. And the foreword, which is by the House of Justice, says, the conclusion of the 20th century provides Baha'is with a unique vantage point. During the past 100 years, our world underwent changes far more profound than any in its preceding history. Changes that are, for the most part, little understood by the present generation. These same 100 years saw the Baha'i cause emerge from obscurity, demonstrating on a global scale the unifying power with which its divine origin has endowed it. As the century drew to its close, the convergence of these two historical developments became increasingly apparent. The Century of Light, prepared under our supervision, reviews these two processes and the relationship between them in the context of the Baha'i teachings. We commend it to the thoughtful study of the friends in the confidence that the perspectives it opens up will prove both spiritually enriching and of practical help in sharing with others the challenging implications of the revelation brought by Baha'u'llah. So that's the introduction by the House of Justice. Then it begins. The 20th century, the most turbulent in the history of the human race, has reached its end. Dismayed by the deepening moral and social chaos that marked its course, the generality of the world's peoples are eager to leave behind them the memories of the suffering that these decades brought with them. No matter how frail the foundations of confidence in the future may seem, no matter how great the dangers looming on the horizon, humanity appears desperate to believe that through some fortuitous conjunction of circumstances, it will nevertheless be possible to bend the conditions of human life into conformity with prevailing human desires. In the light of the teachings of Baha'u'llah, such hopes are not merely illusory, but miss entirely the nature and meaning of the great turning point through which our world has passed in these crucial 100 years. Only as humanity comes to understand the implications of what occurred during this period of history will it be able to meet the challenges that lie ahead. The value of the contribution we as Baha'is can make to this process demands that we ourselves grasp the significance of the historic transformation wrought by the 20th century. What makes this insight possible for us is the light shed by the rising sun of Baha'u'llah's revelation and the influence it has come to exercise in human affairs. It is this opportunity that the following pages address. Now, it's worth reading from time to time books written either in the 19th century or in the early 20th century to have some feeling of how people looked at things and to realize how very different a world it was from the world we're used to now. It's a very short time. I had a book of history at home, which I've now given to my son. which was written during the time of Edward VII, which is not quite as bad as the Victorian age. And there's a nice chapter on it about Samoa, and it refers to Malietoa Taunamawhili I, and the condition in Samoa and the internecine fighting going on there, and the fact that Western Samoa, of course, was a colony of Germany, and the Americans were in the other part of Samoa. All this thing happening so recently. I mean, his son is Malietoa Taunamawhili II. But such a different world. The Samoans were known then as the Irish of the Pacific. As we tend sometimes to think of the peoples of this world as being nice and peaceful until the perfidious Westerners went there, but they were also rather bloodthirsty human beings too. In almost every country, you read the history, and it's a history of chaos and of war and struggle, almost unending. What happened in the 20th century, in the 19th century, which gave people great hope? There were wars then, but there'd been peace for a long time. The intensity of belief in religion was in many ways dying out. Materialism was rising. Prosperity was rising. There was great power centered in the governors of the European countries, and a strange relationship between them. They were not only very powerful monarchs, the Tsar of Russia, the Emperor of Germany, the Emperor of France, the Queen Victoria, but most of them were related to one another. They went to one another on holiday. And they looked upon Europe, as it were, as their playground, you might say. And yet there was this tension of possible war breaking out. Now, they even had great hopes of peace. I think the Tsar was one of the very eager proponents of peace in the world. What they missed was the underlying uncertainty, the underlying unhealthiness of the societies with which they were dealing throughout the world. You read Dickens and you get an idea of the sad condition of the lower classes in this country. There were similar conditions in others. The vast part of the world was very primitive. In the same history book you see photographs of what are now big cities like Melbourne and other parts of the world, which were then tiny little towns. The world was mostly, the civilized world you might say, was mostly Europe, with the United States some way, a little way behind. So it was a world that wasn't yet ripe to overcome the prejudices which divided its peoples. What has happened in the 20th century is really the destruction of the prejudices, of the iniquities which divided people. And it's happened rather in the way that a boil bursts. The 20th century has been a century of incredible suffering, of terrible misbehavior by human beings. But it's very interesting background to these activities. There were strange theories grew up. For example, Nazism isn't just a nasty tyranny which grew up in Europe. It was founded in the concept of eugenics, that as you breed racehorses, you can breed human beings. And obviously, therefore, if you want a perfect world, you breed perfect human beings to rule it. Hence the German concept of the Herrenvolk, the master race. And, in necessary, you obliterate undesirable races. And from the Nazi point of view, Jews and gypsies and others. It's a cold-blooded treatment of human beings as if they were animals, for the best of means, best of intentions. Communism was again an idea for the improvement of human society. The goal of communism was that after the dictatorship of the proletariat and the overthrowing of the tyranny of the bourgeoisie and the rulers, human beings' life would change, they would become good, and as a result of the better behavior of human beings, the state would wither away. We wouldn't need to be governed. But communism didn't work. The state didn't wither away. It became stronger and stronger. Far from all being nice and happy together, we were killing one another to force one another to be good. So this is the 20th century has, as it were, brought out into the open the underlying errors that mankind was following as it emerged from the 19th century. And as the effects of the discoveries, the growth of science, spread to all the rest of the world, and the other nations began to rise up. Africa, out of its sleep of centuries, having been, as it were, plundered by the colonial powers, began to rise up, and it's still struggling out of its turmoil. The peoples in Europe underestimated this. They were thinking only of Europe and of the other countries as being sort of people that the Europeans looked after. You know, the reference to the white man's burden. That is, the Europeans were ahead of everybody. We would show everybody how to live properly. We would raise up everybody else to be nice Christians or whatever, and the world would be fine. And it was the outbreak, I think, of the First World War that really came as the great shock to mankind and undercut this whole optimism. Now, it wasn't only the First World War, because I think many people fought in the First World War with high ideals. My father fought in it. He was in the Battle of the Somme. And I know from talking with them, he quite sincerely believed that this was the war to end all wars. That after the war was over, people would look after the poor. That the soldiers who came back from the front would have work, could raise their families. That didn't happen. The war was followed by the great, that's right, in the 1930s. So the war was followed by great disillusionment. And what this book is really saying is, except that all this was happening, in other words, we had the Guardian speaks of two processes. The process of the rise of the order of Baha'u'llah and the process of the collapse of Western civilization. The collapse of Western civilization takes two forms. One is a degeneration of conditions and of behavior. Marian Hoffman, who you certainly all heard of, and many of you may have known, was on pilgrimage talking to Shoghi Effendi at a time when he was describing to her the rise of the Baha'i World Commonwealth. How, as the faith spread in country after country, the numbers of Baha'is would increase. Eventually, in some countries, there would be so many Baha'is, the government would accept the faith as the state religion. Then later, other countries, the number of Baha'is would increase so much they would become Baha'i states. That the world would, in the meantime, have a world government. And eventually, how the spirit of Baha'u'llah would permeate the world government and we would have a Baha'i World Commonwealth. And it's a wonderful vision. And he again and again spoke of this to the pilgrims and said, we should understand what this is about. In fact, when I was on pilgrimage, he went right back to Adam and described how everything was evolved from the time of Adam through all these religions on into 500,000 years hence. Then he said that was a bit too far to try to look beyond. But Marian said, but Shoghi Effendi, during this time, as you described it, large numbers of people will not become Baha'is. They will resist the faith. They will dislike the faith. What happens to all those people during this long period? And he said they will continue to decline morally and spiritually for the entire dispensation. Now that is the world we have to look at from one point of view. That we see conditions and behavior declining around us. We see what we think of as old standards being lost. We see extraordinary things being done. We shouldn't expect them suddenly to disappear. In other words, the world, in a sense, is going like this. But a second thing is happening to the rest of the world outside the Baha'i faith, and that is the progress of the greater plan of God. The moving of mankind into the lesser peace. So not all individual human beings are going to decline like this. There is going to be a breaking down of the barriers between human beings, a rise in the idealism that is spreading in the world, and an increase in the number of people that are working for the benefit of mankind. So you have the ones who are Baha'is, you have the ones who are rejecting the faith and going whoomp, and the ones who are, as it were, helping mankind move towards unity. And we have to remember also that the ones who are in the destructive direction are also helping to move towards unity, because they are usually destroying those things which divide human beings one from another. So that is what's happening in the world. This book really is to draw to our attention what happened in the faith in relation to the world during this 20th century. And this is really why Abdu'l-Baha would call the 20th century the century of light. In the 19th century, the faith came into being. Baha'u'llah taught, the Bab taught, he was martyred, Baha'u'llah left his message. But Baha'u'llah passed away just before the end of the 19th century. The faith had not become very widely known. It was temporarily in the time of the Bab, and then people lost interest again. But then it was just following the passing of Baha'u'llah and the services of Abdu'l-Baha that began the spread of the faith throughout the whole world, the rise, as it were, of the light of the faith in the East and the West. This began, of course, during the time of Baha'u'llah. We have a wonderful book by Abdu'l-Baha called The Secret of Divine Civilization. It's well worth reading. It's a book written by Abdu'l-Baha to the Persian people. And I think The Guardian refers to it as Abdu'l-Baha's greatest contribution to the organization of human society. It says many things in relation to Iran which are true of the whole world, and is very pertinent to us now. He went to the West and proclaimed the unification of mankind. And I'll come back to that in a minute. In Persia, all sorts of things happened under the guidance of Abdu'l-Baha. The education of girls, the Baha'i schools developed under the guidance of Abdu'l-Baha. He helped the Persian society to move towards, it was not quite democracy, but heading in that direction, and had high hopes. But they didn't work out. The Shahs, who had the possibility of doing this, didn't do it. And so he knew when to step aside. Now, there was as much encouragement given by Abdu'l-Baha to those in Iran who were working for the constitutional movement, but then didn't pay any attention, so he just left that alone. But then there was the wonderful spread of the faith to Ashgabat, a really major Baha'i community, which had its schools, had its Mashraq al-Askar. It grew up, it shed its light, and then it was overwhelmed by the communist revolution in Russia, and the light faded out for the time being. But that was another outpouring of light. Abdu'l-Baha built the shrine of the Bab. It's incredible what he did in that short lifetime. Brought the remains of the Bab there and laid them in the shrine. He made the great public proclamation of the faith to the Western world. Now, we shouldn't forget that before he went to the Western world, he spent a year in Egypt. People often forget that. We think of him just going via Egypt to the West. But he spent a year in Egypt and had a profound effect on Sunni Islam, because the faith was born in Shia Islam. And Abdu'l-Baha had this effect on Sunni Islam, and there are all sorts of things that we can pick up now as the faith advances in relation to the Arab world and Islam, Sunni Islam, which will help us to raise our relationships with those parts of the world. The Baha'is in America, when they got to a certain point, urged Abdu'l-Baha to visit the West. And the time came when he could do it. This book describes Abdu'l-Baha's approach. His gentleness. He was very liberal in his presentation of the faith. He spoke to the people in the terms of the ideals they held and showed how they were possible of fulfillment. He encouraged them. He used generally logical proofs of the faith. Now, in the past, before that, very often the faith was taught simply by fulfillment of prophecy. By the time Abdu'l-Baha was in the West, most people couldn't care less about prophecy. And so he taught the faith based on logical proofs and taught us how to teach the faith. Again, the Guardian used to encourage us to read the reports of Abdu'l-Baha's talks in Promulgation of Universal Peace as an example of how to teach the faith nowadays. When he'd been in Egypt, he went first to London and then spent 2 months in Paris and went back to Alexandria, and finally sailed for the USA in 1912. One striking thing he did in the United States, in addition to this teaching of the faith and propounding the principles of the faith, and this is what's important, it's not just the details of what he taught, but he laid forth the principles of the faith in the Western world, was his proclamation of the covenant. He was able to find enough really devoted souls to proclaim to them the covenant of Baha'u'llah, and that he was the embodiment of that covenant. He could foresee the dangers the faith was facing and the vital importance of the covenant in protecting the faith and carrying it forward. He warned the Baha'is of crises to come in relation to the faith itself, and warned the world of the danger of the outbreak of the First World War. This was in 1913, was when he sailed from Marseilles on the way back to Haifa. He warned us about the war coming, and he foresaw it. We couldn't do anything to stop it. And then after the First World War was over, he warned of a second World War, even worse than the first, due to break out. So when you see the hope and the wonderful picture of the future, which Abdu'l-Baha portrays in his talks, in his writings, it was not through illusion. Abdu'l-Baha knew the world he was dealing with. But this is the aim for which we should, this goal for which we should aim. During the World War, say First World War, Abdu'l-Baha wrote the tablets of the Divine Plan. In other words, by his visit to the Western world, he found communities which were capable of carrying forward the teaching of the faith to the rest of the world. And these again, I don't know how many of you have read the tablets of the Divine Plan in detail. They're worth reading through as a block to see the details which Abdu'l-Baha included. You know, go to this part of the world and teach in this island, this island, this island, this island, and this island. All sorts of details on which the beloved Guardian built the 10-year crusade some years later. He spoke of the destiny of North America. This is another thing we should absorb very profoundly in relation both to our own Baha'i activities and to the conditions in the world. In the Kitab Aqdas, Baha'u'llah does two very interesting things, and in his other tablets. He speaks of the lesser peace, of calling upon the rulers of the world to establish the lesser peace. As they had rejected the most great peace, he said, have mercy on yourselves and those under you and hold fast to the lesser peace. In other words, he calls upon the government of the world, not the Baha'is, to establish a great agreement of nations which will be the lesser peace. In that same thing he indicates, and Baha'is often have the feeling the lesser peace is going to be blissful. You suddenly have the lesser peace and everything's happy, and many friends thought this would happen at the end of the 20th century. But Baha'u'llah says, if after this covenant is established, any country rises up and attacks another, all the others must unitedly arise and destroy that government. That's not peaceful. Baha'u'llah foresaw that the lesser peace would need to be upheld and thoroughly established after its first coming into being. Then he says another very interesting thing in his tablets. It's in the Aqdas again. He calls upon the presidents of the republics of America to uphold justice and to crush the tyrant who flourishes with the rod of the commandments of your Lord. Now, why would he address particularly the presidents of the Western Hemisphere? There's another link there, and that is the things that he wrote and that Abdu'l-Baha wrote about the natives of the Western Hemisphere, the Indian peoples, in other words, what we call Indians, whatever they are, Amerindians, native peoples, the First Nations, throughout that whole part of the world. They have a destiny. They are coming newly, you might say, into the history of Asia and Europe and even Africa. So the Western Hemisphere has a very important function to perform in the pacification of the world, and, as we know, in the development of the faith. The United States in particular, but also Canada and the Latin American republics, have a particular destiny in the development of the faith. It was in America that the Guardian got the National Assembly to write the Declaration of Trust and Bylaws of National Assemblies. He built and established the administrative order there. He used to tell pilgrims that the faith was raised on two pillars, or he was raising the faith on two pillars. There was the pillars of the laws, which was raised in the East, in Iran, and the pillar of the principles, which was being raised in the West. And among the principles are the administrative principles. And among the administrative principles are the entire administrative order. And that he started in the West, and raised up in the West, and went over into the East. And the laws, which we find in the Aqdas and other writings of the faith, he began to establish in Iran, and then gradually have transferred to the West. So now we virtually have it all. The Aqdas is published. We are all struggling to work properly the administrative order. And this was all being founded by Abdu'l-Baha in his visits to the Western world. The passing of Abdu'l-Baha was the end of the apostolic age of the faith. And it's interesting that the faith, unlike other religions, had someone at the helm who could describe its history, show the meaning of the different stages to which it was going. We know we had an apostolic, a heroic age. What happened then and when it ended? And then the Guardian says we enter the formative age. This is the age we're now in, the building of the faith throughout the world. And then in time that will become the golden age. Abdu'l-Baha was a unique figure in the whole history of religions. We have of course, every manifestation of God was an exemplar, inevitably. He was divinely guided by God, and he showed mankind how to live. Each manifestation chose a different way to reveal himself. The Guardian used to say to the pilgrims that, for example, Jesus chose a very high rank. He spoke of himself as the Son of God, the Son of Man. He referred to God as my Father. He made clear there's a difference between the two. Someone addressed him as good master, and he says, don't call me good, no one's good but God. So there was a difference, but nevertheless Jesus was a reflection of God. You know, whoever has seen me has seen the Father. Nobody comes to the Father but by me. Now this, of course, is true of every manifestation of God, that no one comes to God except through the manifestation. But the pattern, the standard which Jesus chose was a very high one, and he concentrated on the individual behavior and the individual life, the individual salvation of every human being, rather than on society as a whole. Muhammad had the job of applying these principles to the whole of society, of raising up nations. And the Guardian explained Muhammad chose a very low station. That the Christians, of course, had made the mistake of deifying Jesus. It's a natural thing to do. That his light was so bright that they said, right, Jesus is God. God, there are three persons in God, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost. And this, of course, is a very sad decision because it rules out the possibility of other revelations. Muhammad, trying to avoid this, chose a lower station. There was God and his messenger. To the degree that there's a lovely story of he in one of the battles, I think it was, he gave an instruction to his followers as to what they should do. And one of the principal followers said, is that your command or is it God's? They said, this is just mine. It's all right, and they disagreed with him. This was the relationship between Muhammad and his followers. We shouldn't underestimate Muhammad from the West, by the way. There's a lovely film called The Message, which you should see if you can, about Muhammad and his years. We know so little about him in faith, but nevertheless, he wanted to emphasize the unity of God. So he as a manifestation, lowered the status of the manifestations to stress this one central point. Now, with Baha'u'llah and the Bab, we can have the two together. We understand what is meant by the manifestation speaking as God, but the manifestation not being the essence of God. It's quite a complex theological understanding. But this again, the Muslims, of course, have misunderstood what Muhammad said about the seal of the prophets. Again, they've shut off history after the coming of Muhammad. The uniqueness of Abdu'l-Baha is that he is clearly not a manifestation of God, but he is a perfect human being. He was able to show us how a perfect Baha'i can live. And now this is wonderful because he isn't the manifestation of God, so he's not in the same status. He is like a human being. Now, I don't think any of us will ever achieve the standard of obedience of Abdu'l-Baha. But as he said, the proper station of all human beings is that of servants. The station of servitude is the proper human status. We should all be servants. Servants of one another, servants of mankind, servants of God. And he showed us how to be a servant. When in preparation for his passing away, he wrote his will and testament. And in this marvelous document, he took the laws of the Aqdas, he took what Baha'u'llah had created and related all the parts together. He confirmed the successorship in the faith of the guardianship and the universal house of justice. He showed how the hands of the cause fitted into the picture. He did so many things in this wonderful document. It's worth reading very, very carefully, which is a light for the whole future of the faith. The Guardian says we wouldn't really be able to understand the implications of the Will and Testament until we had 100 years, 100 years of it working. Because it's in working it that we begin to really to understand it. So Abdu'l-Baha's Will and Testament set in motion a whole new development in the faith. And was followed, of course, by the ministry of Shoghi Effendi. Let's see if I can find a passage here I wanted to read. Oh, yes. Now, the situation when Shoghi Effendi became guardian, of course, was a very precarious one for the faith. The faith, in fact, had been suppressed in the East and was until then virtually ignored in the West. We had a wonderful results from Abdu'l-Baha's visits to the West, but they were not really what he'd hoped for. We look back and we see the effect, but he had hoped for much more. When Shoghi Effendi became guardian, he had hoped to establish international institutions. He had to start virtually alone. He was a young man, 23 was it? And it was an incredible shock to him to be made the guardian. And he'd expected to be helped by his family. It was natural. Here he was, grandson of Abdu'l-Baha. He had 2 brothers and 2 sisters, various cousins, all grandchildren of Abdu'l-Baha. Naturally, he would expect them to obey the will and to help him. But alas, gradually, they defected. One by one, they criticized him, turned against him, and betrayed him. Khanim says at one time the guardian was so alone that the only person he had to consult with was his cook. The Baha'i who was the cook in the house. He was the only faithful person he could find to talk to. He tried to establish the Universal House of Justice. He got some Baha'is to come together and they consulted with the idea of establishing the House of Justice. But he knew it was too soon. The world wasn't yet ready for it. He had to establish the administrative order first. And with the support of the Greatest Holy Leaf, he gathered the communities together. You read his wonderful letters in the administration, Baha'i administration, of what he did with the communities in those early years of the guardianship. In his writings, the passage I want to read here, that's what I was getting. In his writings, he showed us the principle of the oneness of mankind. Page 50. Yeah. Now, the writings of the Guardian are not the easiest to read. But I think we really should understand that literacy is not just something we expect primitive people to have. The pilgrims used to sometimes complain to the Guardian that his language was a bit exalted for people to read. And he said, English is a wonderful language, why shouldn't he use it in all it can do? And the believers had to learn how to understand it. And I think we should remember that. He wasn't trying to be difficult. And you get a misimpression sometimes by thinking the Guardian's language is flowery. In other words, it's embroidered. It isn't. The Guardian's language is extremely concise. He's condensed into one paragraph what would normally take 3 or 4 pages. And that's why it's so intense. And he said what he meant. If you asked the Guardian about one word that he used somewhere, he could tell you why he meant that word, not some other word. Now in this particular passage, he says, the unity of the human race as envisaged by Baha'u'llah implies the establishment of a world commonwealth in which all nations, races, creeds and classes are closely and permanently united, and in which the autonomy of its state members and the personal freedom and initiative of the individuals that compose them are definitely and completely safeguarded. This commonwealth must, as far as we can visualize it, consist of a world legislature whose members will, as the trustees of the whole of mankind, ultimately control the entire resources of all the component nations, and will enact such laws as shall be required to regulate the life, satisfy the needs, and adjust the relationships of all races and peoples. A world executive backed by an international force will carry out the decisions arrived at and apply the laws enacted by this world legislature, and will safeguard the organic unity of the whole Commonwealth. A world tribunal will adjudicate and deliver its compulsory and final verdict on all and any disputes that may arise between the various elements constituting this universal system. The economic resources of the world will be organized. Its sources of raw materials will be tapped and fully utilized. Its markets will be coordinated and developed, and the distribution of its products will be equitably regulated. Now, it's interesting, you see, he says here, as far as we can envisage. Even he is outlining a pattern that will evolve, not giving specific details. Then, having built the administrative order, the Guardian implemented the divine plan. And there's a very important quotation in section 6 of this book, which I'll now read. Page 6 to 7. This is a description of the station to which, in this case, the North American believers, but I believe all believers, are called. And it's worth reading and rereading. It says, by the sublimity and serenity of their faith, by the steadiness and clarity of their vision, the incorruptibility of their character, the rigor of their discipline, the sanctity of their morals, and the unique example of their community life, they can and indeed must, in a world populated with its incurable corruption, in a world polluted with its incurable corruptions, paralyzed by its haunting fears, torn by its devastating hatreds, and languishing under the weight of its appalling miseries, demonstrate the validity of their claim to be regarded as the sole repository of that grace upon whose operation must depend the complete deliverance, the fundamental reorganization, and the supreme felicity of all mankind. Now, I want to read that again because I think it's an extremely important passage. It gives us an idea not only of the standard we have to rise to, but of what's dependent upon us and of the effect that we're called upon to have on the rest of the world. He says, by the sublimity and serenity of their faith, by the steadiness and clarity of their vision, the incorruptibility of their character, the rigor of their discipline, the sanctity of their morals, and the unique example of their community life, they can and indeed must, in a world polluted with its incurable corruptions, paralyzed by its haunting fears, torn by its devastating hatreds, and languishing under the weight of its appalling miseries, demonstrate the validity of their claim to be regarded as the sole repository of that grace upon whose operation must depend the complete deliverance, the fundamental reorganization, and the supreme felicity of all mankind. Now, we can't obviously, as Baha'is, go around to our non-Baha'i neighbors and tell them that, look, we're this sort of people. That's his point. But it relates to this status or station of the Baha'i community as being a proof of the truth of the revelation of Baha'u'llah. Now, in the Promise of World Peace, the House of Justice offers the Baha'i community as an example of how human beings can work peacefully together. It's already been done, the offer has been made. And in place after place, people are waking up to this fact and are admiring the function of the Baha'i community in this way, and are beginning to take lessons from Baha'is in this way of operating, of consultation and so on. But it affects us in every way: our personal lives, our relationship with other people, because every Baha'i is looked upon as an example of the faith, a sample of the faith, you might say. If we begin to cheat anybody, they say, oh, the Baha'is are just like anybody else. Anything we do has an effect on this, on the whole future of mankind. And people watch us. One learns this very much if one lives in Haifa, because start with, you learn after a while that people are watching us, they know you're Baha'is. There was a lovely story, which fortunately is a nice story, of a time when the American fleet was in harbour in Haifa, and a lot of the sailors came on shore and behaved as sailors on shore often will do. Though they were pretty good on the whole, they were honest and nice people, but a lot of the more conservative Israelis got rather agitated. And there was a group of American sailors up in the Merkaz on Mount Carmel one day, and the Baha'i passing by, I think he was a security guard, but he was working the faith, and he was an American too, and looked like an American. And this Israeli was upbraiding these sailors, saying, "You sailors, you come here, you misbehave with our girls, you swear, you drink," tearing strips off them. And they were rather taken aback. And he suddenly turned to this passing Baha'i and said, "Not you, you're a Baha'i, you're good." And then, and then turned back to blasting these poor sailors. But of course the Baha'i was astonished. How did he know he's a Baha'i? Why should he have suddenly made this exception? He must have known somehow or other. And you find that as you're living in Haifa, that people know, and I think you find more and more in our own society here, Baha'is will get known. People may not always say something, but what we do reflects the whole work of the faith. Now, what did the Guardian do in this way of raising up the faith? And this is part of this light of this century. To start with, there's his letters, pouring them out, year after year after year. And it's worth reading even the early letters now. They all show the care of the Guardian for the communities. There are so many of them, you can't read them all, but at least the published World Order letters, for example, the Advent of Divine Justice, the Promised Day has come, and of course God Passes By, which is his commentary, you might say, on the history of the faith up to 1944. And let us see, really, from a God's eye view, what was taking place in the world. We can find out from any history who went where and what physical thing happened. But what was the significance of it in the history of mankind? We find that out from God Passes By. Then there were the teaching plans he called us to. The first 7-year plan, the second 7-year plan, the 10-year crusade, the intermediate plans that came into being with the second 7-year plan, the British 6-year plan, for example, and the 2-year plan in Africa. All these the Guardian used to guide the believers. And we were a very small community. I remember when the 6-year plan ended, the community was so delighted because it was a big job. It was raising 5 local assemblies up to 24. 19 new local assemblies in that period. And the community didn't really get going until about 3 years through the plan. But then it got going. And I think the percentage of Baha'is in the British community who pioneered, this is home front pioneering, of course, but what else? During the 6-year plan, eclipsed any other pioneer records in the world. And the Guardian was thrilled to bits with the functioning of the British Baha'i community at that time. So the end of the plan came, and everybody was very happy. And lo and behold, we get the Guardian calling upon the British Baha'is to go to Africa. and open up centres in East and West Africa. Now, people didn't know much about Africa in those days. I went to a map shop in London. I've forgotten the name of the street, but it sold maps. It was a famous map shop. And I wanted to buy a map of Kenya. So I said to the girl, could I have a map of Kenya, please? And she said, oh, yes, sir. And she went to look at the thing, and that's in Africa, isn't it? So she eventually found the map and gave it to me. But people didn't know much about the world. Dear Claire Gung, who earned the title from The Guardian of the Mother of Africa, was a German Baha'i who came to Britain, and she was so seasick getting here, she promised herself that she would never leave the country once she was here. She wasn't getting any more seasickness. She sailed to Africa and established a faith in East Africa. So this 2-year plan was then a new departure, because he called in other national assemblies and had several assemblies working together. And when you look back and realize what happened afterwards, you see the wisdom and the essential guidance given by just having this 2-year plan and the assemblies collaborating. Now, as a result of the World War II, all sorts of certainties in the world went by the board. And The Guardian comments on this in here, page 71. No, sorry, this isn't The Guardian commenting, it's the book commenting. Yeah, this is talking about the Guardian's prophetic statements about the development of the world. It says, the entry into the war by the United States, whose president had initiated the project of a system of international order, but which had itself rejected this visionary initiative, that was President Wilson in the League of Nations, would lead that nation, Shoghi Effendi predicted, and this is his prediction, to assume through adversity its preponderating share of responsibility to lay down once for all broad, worldwide, unassailable foundations of that discredited yet immortal system. Now, the function of the United States in establishing the basis of an international system, which is, of course, the United Nations. Now, it says, these statements proved prophetic. This is back to the book. With the end of hostilities, it gradually became apparent that a fundamental shift in consciousness was underway throughout the world, and that inherited assumptions, institutions, and priorities that had been progressively undermined by forces at work during the first half of the century were now crumbling. If the change could not yet be described as an emerging conviction about the oneness of humankind, no objective observer could mistake the fact that barriers blocking such a realization, which had survived all the assaults against them earlier in the century, were at last giving way. So remember I spoke of the rigidity it is at the end of the 19th century and the breakdown of things in the First World War. This is now the real crumbling of the trouble. One's mind turns to the prophetic words of the Quran, and you see the mountains and think them solid, but they shall pass away as the passing away of the clouds. The effect was to inspire in progressive minds a sense of confidence that it would be possible to construct a new kind of society that would not only preserve the long-term peace of the world, but enrich the lives of all its inhabitants. And this, of course, relates to that second part of what's happening with the non-Baha'is that I mentioned at the very beginning, the building up of international institutions, the United Nations and all its dependent agencies. What the United Nations has not always been successful in is enforcing peace. There have been two major events that have been worth thinking about from this point of view. One, of course, was the invasion of Kuwait by Iraq. I think it's the first time when one country attacked another that the other country said, no, go back or we'll clobber you. And he didn't go back, and the other nations clobbered Iraq. Now, they partly clobbered it. You see, the Baha'u'llah's statement is of one nation, but this was, of course, Baha'u'llah's context is that they've got the lesser peace established. We haven't yet got the lesser peace established. We're sort of urging ourselves in that direction. But it's still the idea that one country just isn't allowed to go and attack another by itself. So the other countries attacked Iraq, drove it back, and demanded certain conditions. What then happened was that the United Nations had a sort of loss of will, you might say, because for 12 years they patiently waited for Iraq to do what it was told to do, and it didn't. And then you had this second Gulf War, with the enforcement of peace undertaken not by the United Nations but by the President of America. You see what I mean earlier by saying Baha'u'llah called upon two different things? Now, I'm not saying America was right to invade Iraq in the Second Gulf War, but it's the sort of thing that I think Baha'u'llah was thinking about. If the world nations as a body together cannot enforce peace, if you conquer a country that has been aggressing and required conditions to put itself right again that doesn't meet the conditions, then you should go in again and make it do what it's told. Now, so we've got awful troubles now in Iraq, and America has awful troubles, but we're learning the sort of troubles mankind is going to have to deal with. Maybe that was the wrong way of dealing with it. Maybe it was a mistake to invade Iraq at that time. We don't know. We should never know, because we don't know what would have happened if something else had been done. I'm giving these examples because this is all part of what we call the century of light. And of course, war is a dark thing. But we must see how it's mankind groping towards the establishment of discipline in the world. Other things have happened. One was the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. This was a thing that would have been unthinkable before the Second World War. That the world authority would have laid down universal rights which all governments must obey. Now, we still don't do it very well. We have all sorts of problems with the upholding of human rights in the world, but it's moving in that direction. The process has started. There were the Nuremberg trials after the Second World War. This again is a thing that many people regard as, in fact, as basically illegal, and I think probably it was. The trial of people of a country for what were regarded as offences against the whole of mankind. That had never happened before. There were quite a number of the Germans who were accused said, but I was obeying orders. And that was always used to be the excuse. A soldier did what he was instructed. But now mankind is saying, yes, but there are some things you don't obey orders for. There are some things which are universal human standards which you don't do. And of course, the thing that was regarded as illegal, they then punished retroactively people who committed these crimes. And normally, again, in most human law, systems of law, you don't retroactively apply a law. It's unjust. So on the surface of it, it looked unjust, but it was a tremendous step forward in mankind's attitude to human behavior. That there are some offences you cannot excuse by saying that you're fighting for your country or your government instructed you to do it. It's interesting because Richard III in England was killed, and a lot of people who supported him were clobbered by Henry VII rather, and the barons quietly after that. Because Henry VII had said Richard III was a usurper and therefore the people should be punished. After that, got him to make a law that no one could be punished for obeying the instructions of a person who at that time was his lawful sovereign. They couldn't defend themselves against Henry VII, but they got nasty in the law that henceforth, if we do what the king tells us, nobody's going to punish us afterwards. That's the opposite of Nuremberg. It's the standard which was usually adopted. Because if you can get punished by anybody who comes along afterwards, you're in trouble. That's why we're still working. I think mankind is working out the implications of the Nuremberg trials and what it means for the future. What is genocide? How do you define it? what are things which soldiers should not obey, that changes totally the idea of an army. I mean, everybody used to think it very funny that the Swedish army could go on strike. But it does, and Sweden seems to survive. There are new ideas opening up. This, I think, is what he was meaning by the crumbling of these old standards. Some of the crumbling is unpleasant for all the different countries. I wonder if that's the best place for me to pause now. Wait a minute. These are the things that were happening in the world, which were showing that the crumbling, as I say, of the rigid standards of the past, which were preventing the evolution of world unity. In the faith itself, of course, the Guardian also developed the administration in one very important new way. And this was the appointment of hands of the cause of God, and the instruction to the hands to appoint auxiliary board members. You see, in the beginning, all that Baha'u'llah and Abdu'l-Baha could really do was to use good, devoted Baha'is to carry out their instructions. They initiated for a while certain consultative bodies. Abdu'l-Baha, for example, started the local assembly of Tehran, and he said that the hands should be members of it. But what had happened in the West was that they had these great Baha'is who were sort of running the show, because they were the only people willing to do it. And the institution of the local assemblies and the national assemblies was a shift from individual authority, even the moral authority, towards institutional authority. And the Baha'is had just learned that, and were getting nice and comfortable dealing with assemblies, local assemblies and national assemblies. Suddenly the Guardian appoints hands of the cause of God. And here you have a strange character. You have someone who has no priestly authority. There are no sacraments in the faith to function with. They didn't marry people. They have no governing authority. They can't rule the communities or give, shall we say, executive instructions to the Baha'is. They have a moral authority, and a very high moral authority. And it took a long time for the Baha'is to cotton onto this. What is this moral authority of the hands of the cause of God? The American National Assembly, in all innocence, in fact, its national report was written by Horace Holly, who was a hand of the cause himself. It published its annual report, and it placed the report of the hands of the cause among the reports of the national committees. And the Guardian was furious. He said they should go down on their knees before the hands of the cause of God. Don't they know who they are? So it's a very interesting thing. Here you have the hands of the cause as individuals in the faith who have tremendous responsibility and great moral authority, but no, shall we say, legal instructive authority. They can consult national assemblies, they urge national assemblies, they advise national assemblies. National assemblies have to pay great attention to what they say. But the National Assembly also had the duty to consult upon what they said, and if necessary, decide the opposite. And that's a difficult concept. And it's taken the Baha'is quite a long while to work this out. But it's a very important thing for the faith, because you have now these two arms. One, an elected arm building up towards the House of Justice, which was responsible for the actual administration of the faith. The other, individuals appointed by the World Centre of the Faith, with its authority going downwards. Through in those days the hands, now the councillors, and the auxiliary board members, who are, as we're beginning to see now, absolutely invaluable in the work of the faith. The things they can do, they act as individuals. The Guardian said ultimately all the teaching of the faith is under the guidance of this appointed arm, because the assemblies will be so busy administering the Baha'i communities. They'll be so big. I mean, they're dealing with all sorts of things, including the running of the railways and the taxes and harvesting. Everything in the community, the assemblies will be running. But the work of the teaching work and the defense of the faith will be in the hands of people who do not have administrative authority. They don't act in the way that assemblies do. It's a complex thought. But this is another light, you may say, that the Guardian gave to the community. He had only just given it not long before he passed away. Because that's the point at which I think I'm to stop tonight. It was the passing of Shoghi Effendi. Because everyone was so devoted to Shoghi Effendi, and he was still a young man, 61 I think he was, and seemed very vigorous. But he was being absolutely bowed down by his work. Someone once said to Rahir Khanum, was it the failure of the Baha'is to do what he wanted them to do that caused him to his heart to break? And he said no. She said it was the covenant breakers, and what they had done to him all these years just wore him away. And we should remember this when we hear people called covenant breakers, and we should understand what they've done in the lives of the centers of the faith. One example is in the case of Abdul Baha when he traveled to the West. There was I think this man was a nephew rather, of Abdul Baha's wife, Dr. Farid. He traveled with Abdul Baha. And one of the things, he was always doing strange things. One thing he did, he went quietly to a wealthy Baha'i and pointed out that Abdul Baha wasn't accepting any gifts because it wasn't really appropriate for him to do so, but really it would be very helpful to him if she could give him some money to do all the things he had to do. This was a terrible test for this Baha'i, and was a shame, of course, for Abdul Baha. Abdul Baha would never have permitted anyone to do such a thing. And when he went back, got back to Haifa, Rahir Khanum said that he came into the master's house. He walked up the stairs into the house, went straight to the room of Munira Khanum and said to her, "Farid has ground me up." So that's the effect of one man with his personal shortcomings. By then he hadn't become a covenant breaker. He just, while still apparently a true Baha'i, he just kept doing things which were, as it were, causing endless trouble for Abdul Baha. Then he broke the covenant in due course. But I mention this because it's an aspect of this whole situation which we have to bear in mind when we're discussing this century of light. And I think it's a good place to break now for the passing of Shoghi Effendi. Then we can go on for the development after that, the rest of the 20th century. Thank you. The first part of the talk really presented in relation to the period up to the passing of Shoghi Effendi, from the beginning of the century, the pattern of three processes taking place. They're really three processes, there's two parts of one. Outside the faith, there are two things happening, both of which relate to the breaking down of the barriers among human beings. One of these processes is generally seen as being very destructive, and it's usually also very uncomfortable for human beings because barriers they've been used to disappear. And you don't have to describe what they are, you see it yourselves in the world. Tensions that have existed in the past blow up into wars, into trials that people have to overcome. Then the second part of this process is the broadening of the area of collaboration in the world, and the raising up of institutions in the world, fostering unity and harmony. These two things are happening simultaneously outside the faith. And naturally, the faith is aware of it, all the Baha'is are part of this. But parallel with this, as the Guardian points out, is the process of the faith itself, which is the rise and establishment and perfecting of the present, the gift that Baha'u'llah has brought to mankind. We've got to a stage in evolution where there is a a sudden advance forward. Now, evolution, apparently, the more they study it, proceeds in this way. It isn't just a steady advance. There are great surges, which mankind then gets used to. And this has been detected by many people over these past years. H.G. Wells, for example, he was one of the writers and editors of what he called an outline of history, which is, I think, a brilliant work, really trying to tackle the history of the world as distinct from just separate little histories of parts of it. And it has an interesting feature, inasmuch there was a board of editors. And every now and again you find that some of the editors didn't agree with what had been finally done, so you have a little footnote about commenting that we don't think it was quite like this, it was like something else, which makes it a very interesting book. But this book presents towards the end this concept of mankind having reached a new stage in evolution. And Wells points out, that there's no reason why Homo sapiens, as a whatever it is, should survive any more than anything else. The dinosaurs went out. History is full of species being destroyed and changing and coming to being. So he points out this point of human history requires mankind to make an enormous step forward. If not, it'll just drop out of history. Now, he was very hopeful when writing that volume, but later in life he wrote a second smaller history book, and he warns us that he's an old man by this time, but he's very much discouraged. He says, as far as he can see, there are a few human beings are going to seize the possibilities, to understand what is happening to mankind and rise to the challenge. But he fears that the vast majority won't bother about it. They'll carry on with their normal work and gradually just disappear. So that part of mankind, he came to the conclusion because of this, that mankind in fact was on its way out. Naturally we don't believe that, but we see the same process happening. It isn't just that many people oppose the unity of mankind, but vast numbers of people aren't interested in that. They're interested in their own particular little businesses, and they go away at that, ignoring the effects on the rest of mankind. So this is the pattern that the book portrays. These two advances, or two changes in the world as a whole, but above all, the importance of the rise of the faith. To a non-Baha'i sociologist, the rise of the faith may at this time seem to be a very minor issue. But it's like the beginnings of almost everything. The very beginnings are almost imperceptible. But understanding as we do that Baha'u'llah is the manifestation of God who is sent here precisely to raise mankind to the next stage of its evolution, we know that every aspect of the development of the faith is of tremendous importance for the whole of mankind. And that really is also what this book is about. The central theme of this book is about the rise and establishment of the Baha'i order in this period of the 20th century. We got as far last time as in history as the passing of Shoghi Effendi. How many of the friends here actually were Baha'is during the time of Shoghi Effendi? You put up your hand, anyone who was? 1, 2, 3. Were Baha'is during the lifetime of Shoghi Effendi? You were, obviously, yes?
But I did not see him.
No, you don't have to see him. Just how many Baha'is are here from that period? How many were Baha'is in those before November 1957? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yeah, you see, it's not a lot. 5. It shows how much the faith has grown since those days. But it was, of course, to the Baha'is of that period, the passing of the Guardian was completely unexpected and absolutely shattering. And this period immediately following the passing of Shoghi Effendi is of tremendous importance in the history of the faith. One couldn't see it approaching, but looking back, you can see certain things that the Guardian did. And Ruhir Khanum said he himself didn't seem to foresee his passing, and I was consciously, and she should know, he would be talking with her. But his action, for example, in one of his last messages, in referring to the hands of the cause as the chief stewards of Baha'u'llah's embryonic world commonwealth, was crucial to the unity of the faith. Now, it wasn't that he appointed them as that. He simply said that's what the hands are, and they would have been so if he continued to live. But you see the significance of that title when he died. A steward is someone who's in charge of the place for the boss. And if the boss isn't there, or he dies and the heir can't take over, he keeps running. He's running. And that's what the hands did. And they're the chief stewards, because there's another place where the Guardian refers to the National Assemblies as stewards of the Baha'i World Commonwealth. So these were the chief stewards, which again is important because it let the National Assemblies know where they should turn. Now, we saw Ruhir Khanum at that time and marveled at her strength, because as anyone could see, she'd be absolutely shattered at such an event. I mean, he wasn't only her guardian, he was her dearly loved husband, and they'd gone through very hard times together. And she just simply drew together everybody. She stood at his grave anointing the friends as we went by his funeral. She was the one that gathered all the hands together and persuaded them to meet in Bashi. I don't think they had any resistance to doing that, but she had to get them together. And it wasn't easy because the faith was still very much both Eastern and Western. The laws of the faith which had been applied in Iran had mostly not yet been applied in the West. So even the hands of the cause had to recognize that the Guardian had applied the laws and principles of the faith in accordance to the stage of development and the capacities of the Baha'is in the different parts of the world. And that took quite a bit of rethinking. I've heard her say several times more recently, however, there were two things which upheld her after the Guardian passed away. One was some years before, I think it was years before, some time before anyway. One day the Guardian, when writing or at his desk, suddenly said to her, "What will you do after me?" And she was horrified. She said, "Choki Effendi didn't say that." Well, he was a young man still. He was desperately upset that he was talking about his dying. And he just ignored her protests and said, "You will travel and encourage the friends." He did, then he went on to some other subject. I don't know whether it was an instruction or just he saw what she would do. And of course that's where she felt she should do that after he passed away. When they were in London, the Guardian had been ill with Asiatic flu. And he'd been working hard on the maps of the 10-year crusade. And he had a tremendous burden with the 10-year crusade. It had been going wonderfully at first, then it was slowing down. He was very worried about it. And he was exhausted. And he suddenly said to Ruhir Khanum, "I can't go back to Haifa. I won't go. You must go ahead of me and you'll know what to do." And again she was rather taken aback, but at that point it seemed to her that she was going ahead of him and would do it. But she knew afterwards this had a more profound implication, and again strengthened her that he should say, you will know what to do. So she gave her the confidence to gather the hands together, to encourage the Baha'i world to turn to the hands. And all the way through the ministry of the custodians, the hands were encouraging the friends, stimulating them, and preserving the unity of the faith, because it was very difficult. There were Baha'is discussing in all sorts of ways whether there would be a guardian or there wouldn't be a guardian, and could get very het up about it. And so the hands kept on saying, "Don't speculate. And that they held their faith together in that way, and then eventually handed over to the Universal House of Justice. There was the event, of course, of the breaking of the covenant by Charles Mason Reamy in 1961. That one of the hands should break the covenant was this incredible experience. And they really didn't know what to do. It's well worth reading that book, The Ministry of the Custodians, which Rahir Khanum wrote, simply because it gives you a picture of how things that were happening and how the hands had to cope with things in those days. That was the first big blow, was the passing of the breaking of the covenant by Mason Reamy. Then there was a second one, which I don't know if that book even mentions. But in Haifa and Akka, there were quite a number of Baha'is still. When I went there first in '61, it was a very funny situation when there was a meeting of the community. I couldn't put my finger on it, but it just felt a bit strange. And then we found out what was happening. The covenant-breaking members of the family had infected a number of the Baha'is living in the Holy Land. And one day in 1962, it's shortly before the election of the House of Justice, one of the very loyal Baha'is from Haifa happened to go and visit one of the Baha'is in Akka and found him sitting having tea with a whole lot of covenant breakers. So it was clear that the loyal Baha'is in Akka, or some of them, were just, hand in hand with the covenant breakers. So at that point, the hands had to interview all the Baha'is living in the Holy Land. The Baha'is had been there for a long time. And the majority of them persisted in their attitude and were expelled from the faith. Now this was a problem the hands didn't need at that particular point. But it gives you an idea of why the hands were so desperately eager that nothing should interfere with the proper and pure election of the Universal House of Justice. So they went to every single extreme to be sure that nothing would go wrong, and nothing did go wrong. One problem was, I think there were one or two Baha'is had obviously started traveling around the world, giving talks everywhere and giving money for haziras and so on. It looked very nice, and Baha'is were very happy to have been given haziras and so on. But it was quite clear, knowing from Haifa, knowing who these people were and what their attitude was, that they were, as it were, sort of tacitly electioneering to be elected to the House of Justice. And the hands worried. Said, what should we do? Should we say something? But that's an interference. So they decided they could do nothing. They had to leave it to God. And the result, I think, showed the wisdom and the common sense of the members of the National Assemblies around the world. Because these people who'd been doing this, nowhere near elected. So there was everything went straightforwardly without any problem, and they had the House of Justice. And once the House of Justice came into being, of course, immediately the hands of the cause of God turned to the House of Justice. I remember a meeting where Paul Haney, who was, as it were, looking after the funds for the hands, came and met with the Universal House of Justice and explained, there were funds around, and at that point handed over $100,000 to the House of Justice to get on with while we were getting things sorted out. And all the time, therefore, the hands just kept things running, ready to hand anything over at any time, as soon as the House of Justice was ready for it. The House of Justice used to meet with the hands regularly to discuss problems. There was I'm giving you these little side issues, as it were, just to give you an explanation of the sort of things that had to be coped with and how the hands helped the House. There's a village in Jordan called Adasiya, and it was founded actually on land which was meant to be endowment land for the support of the Shrine of Baha'u'llah. And this was a beautiful Baha'i village with a local spiritual assembly. Abdul Baha went and stayed in the local hazira, and he called it the Blessed Village of Adasiya. And later, alas, the covenant breakers infected that village to the point that the Guardian said, alas, it has become the accursed village of Adesea. Now what happened was the members of the family who broke the covenant had the title deeds to Adesea. And the Guardian said, right, that's their legal property, they can have it. At one point, the covenant breakers were trying to get a lot of the title deeds, and he said, you can take anything, but I must have the shrines. He held the shrines in his hand because he had to protect them. But Adesea was one of the bits of property that went into the hands of the covenant-breaking members of the family. And so the Guardian made the covenant breakers and the tenants in Adesea come to an agreement. And the agreement was that the tenants were never to be sent off the land. They had a right to be tenants. The covenant breakers were not to dismiss them. On the other hand, the tenants were never to obtain even a square meter of ownership of the land. The ownership must remain with the owners, with the covenant breakers. Now what happened at this point, after the election of the House of Justice, was that the covenant breakers had fled away from Jordan, and the Jordanian government had nationalized the land and were giving the land of former landowners to the tenants. And so the tenants in Adesea wrote to the House of Justice and said, can we accept this land from the government? And then the House of Justice consulted the hands of the cause, and we had the whole background, and answered the tenants, said no, the Guardian has insisted this agreement be signed and you must remain true to it. You cannot accept a square meter of that land. If they allow you to continue to farm there, God bless you, but no, you can't accept it to own it. And the Baha'is of Adesea obeyed. And it wasn't too long after that the Palestinian Liberation Organization moved into the area and drove out the people from that area, and the Baha'is went and lived in another part of Jordan, and that became a little center of attacks on Israel. But it was this knowledge of the past that was so valuable from the hands to the House of Justice to know what to answer in particular situations like this. And there are lots of these things happening. You don't find them in Baha'i News because it was a local problem. Now in the world as a whole, there was a profound, development had taken place in the attitude of human beings through this first part of the century. I hope to get the right one here. Where are we? Yeah. You know, after the war, you had the Cold War. Everyone was happily over the war with the Axis powers. Then, of course, there was the tension between the East and the West. And I'll read you this passage from, I'll read you more than I originally intended because I think you need to see the whole picture. It's on pages 88 and 89 of this book. It says, since the driving force of colonialism itself was economic exploitation, it was perhaps inevitable that most movements of liberation assumed a broadly socialistic ideological cast. Within only a few short years, these circumstances had created a fertile ground for exploitation by the world's superpowers. For the Soviet Union, the situation seemed to offer an opportunity to induce a shift in the existing alignment of nations by gaining a preponderating influence in what was by now beginning to be called the Third World. The response of the West, wherever development aid failed to retain the loyalties of recipient populations, was to resort to the encouragement and arming of a wide variety of authoritarian regimes. And as outside forces manipulated new governments, attention was increasingly diverted from an objective consideration of developmental needs to ideological and political struggles that bore little or no relation to social or economic reality. The results were uniformly devastating. Economic bankruptcy, gross violations of human rights, the breakdown of civil administration, and the rise of opportunistic elites who saw in the suffering of their countries only openings for self-enrichment. Such was the heartbreaking fate that engulfed one after another of the new nations who only short years before had begun life with such great promise. Inspiring these political, social, and economic crises was the inexorable rise and consolidation of a disease of the human soul, infinitely more destructive than any of its specific manifestations. Its triumph marked a new and ominous stage in the process of social and spiritual degeneration that Shoghi Effendi had identified. Fathered by 19th century European thought, acquiring enormous influence through the achievements of American capitalist culture, and endowed by Marxism with the counterfeit credibility peculiar to that system, materialism emerged full-blown in the second half of the 20th century as a kind of universal religion, claiming absolute authority in both the personal and social life of humankind. Its creed was simplicity itself. Reality, including human reality and the process by which it evolves, is essentially material in nature. That's the creed. The goal of human life is, or ought to be, the satisfaction of material needs and wants. Society exists to facilitate this quest, and the collective concern of humankind should be an ongoing refinement of the system aimed at rendering it ever more efficient in carrying out its assigned task. So these, of course, are all the benevolent things, nevertheless infused with materialism. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, impulses to devise and promote any formal materialistic belief system disappeared. Nor would any useful purpose have been served by such efforts, as materialism was soon facing no significant challenge in most parts of the world. Religion, where not simply driven back into fanaticism and unthinking rejection of progress, became progressively reduced to a kind of personal preference, a predilection, a pursuit designed to satisfy spiritual and emotional needs of the individual. The sense of historical mission that had defined the major faiths learned to content itself with providing religious endorsement for campaigns of social change carried on by secular movements. The academic world, once the scene of great exploits of mind and spirit, settled into the role of a kind of scholastic industry, preoccupied with tending its machinery of dissertations, symposia, publication, credits, and grants. Whether as worldview or simple appetite, materialism's effect is to leach out of human motivation and even interest the spiritual impulses that distinguish the rational soul. Is it the resulting in the absence of conviction about the spiritual nature of reality and the fulfillment it alone offers, it is not surprising to find at the very heart of the current crisis of civilization a cult of individualism that increasingly admits of no restraint and that elevates acquisition and personal advancement to the status of major cultural values. The resulting atomization of society has marked a new stage in the process of disintegration about which the writings of Shoghi Effendi speak so urgently. So that, in other words, is the significance of what was happening in the second half of the 20th century outside the Baha'i faith. I'm trying to avoid the sun. Now the victory of the 10-year crusade and the election of the Universal House of Justice are in themselves an extraordinary turning point in the history of mankind. People don't talk much about it nowadays, but of course there was a prophecy of Daniel, which used to be referred to before the end of the crusade, of the tremendous significance of this time It will cause the whole of mankind to rejoice. It's come and gone, most of mankind have ignored it, but we shouldn't forget this prophecy. Now, for some 37 years, the cause progressed along two tracks. One was expansion and consolidation, and the second was increasing influence in society. In other words, the first is really ourselves and gathering in more mankind into the faith, training them in the teachings, upbuilding Baha'i laws. The second is doing what we can to aid mankind by sharing the message with them so far as they can absorb it and affecting the way that human beings deal with their problems. I think it was as long ago as the constitutional movement in Iran, where, or maybe later, I think certainly in the time of Abdu'l-Baha, that he commented to some people that, look, even if you don't accept the claims of Baha'u'llah, try the system that he recommends. If you don't like it, you can always give it up. But this is there for you to try it. He said the same thing about war once, but you know, it's mankind has been fighting throughout its history. We should at least try peace. If it doesn't work, we can always go back to war again. So with this double process taking place in the world, the House of Justice established a series of teaching plans, very similar to the ones the Guardian had established in the world. I'll tell you when they were, because I always get confused myself of when they take place. The first of all was the 9-year plan from 64 to 73, and there was a year of respite after that. A 5-year plan, 74 to 79, a 7-year plan from 79 to 86, a 6-year plan for 86 to 92. Now that was followed in 92 by the Holy Year, the centenary of the ascension of Baha'u'llah. And then the whole pattern began to change. One reason was the increase in the volatility of human behavior and the situation in the world. The House of Justice felt unable to project long plans. So after 62, you have a 3-year plan from 93 to 96, then a 4-year plan from 96 to 2000, and then a 12-month plan from 2000 to 2001, up to the end of the 20th century. And you know now there's 2 more 5-year plans followed after that. The 4-year plan marked a major change within the Baha'i community. It wasn't sudden, it was part of the gathering of the experience of the past. Because as these plans have gone ahead, there was a progressive decentralization of the planning process. It became impossible to plan everything from the world center. Not only impossible, but undesirable. So more and more the planning was pushed down to the National Assembly level with the assistance of the councillors' advice and the auxiliary board members. It took the National Assembly quite a time to work out what the fixing of goals meant. Quite a lot of them simply sent a list of goals that were nothing more than wish lists, hadn't borne no relationship to the capacity of the community. And with an increase in the size of the community, it became more and more difficult to fix numerical goals, for example. When you have 20 assemblies, you can make a nice goal of double the number of the assemblies. When you have 1,500 assemblies, if you can double them, why can't you triple them? You know, the number is so enormous. You can't give that sort of thing. Some national assemblies wanted to have goals of so many new believers. And the House of Justice said, no, that's not within your capacity. You can't decide who's going to become Baha'is. You can have goals for what you're going to do. And you can open new territories, you can form local assemblies. But to say that so many people are going to become Baha'is is not a feasible goal. So we had to always continue to concentrate on what the Baha'is should do. And over this period, gradually, the assemblies and learned better and better how to plan. And of course, at the same time, the boards of councillors and the auxiliary board members were learning their functions. It took quite a long time for the believers to really understand what councillors were, what they were meant to do, how they fitted into the whole structure. Because some Baha'is, this is, and it's worn again, the thing I was saying the other day, try not to double guess what things mean for the future. We have to accept as Baha'is that because this is the kingdom of God on earth and we're receiving divine guidance through the House of Justice and through the Guardian and Abdul Baha, there are things we don't know and we can't know. It's God's business. So we shouldn't try and cook things up for ourselves before they're ready for delivery to us. One of the things the friends thought up, some friends, not many, after the passing of the Guardian, was that the institution of the hands of the cause was a temporary thing, rather like a scaffolding when you're going to build a building. That the real essence of the faith, the real administrative order, was the Universal House of Justice, the National Assemblies, local assemblies. And this other arm was a sort of funny excrescence which we seem to have around, and the real explanation was it's only a temporary thing, and once it's built up the national and local assemblies, then it'll disappear. Which is a complete misunderstanding of the whole basis, but it shows how people, by trying to explain away things they find uncomfortable, can get into all sorts of difficult situations. When we find something in the faith uncomfortable, we have to try and educate ourselves into being comfortable with it. And to understand it by understanding it in its full context. And we shouldn't be ashamed that it takes us time. We're only ordinary human beings. We're the ones that God was able to get to accept his faith after the real invitees turned it down. I mean, the kings of the world and the leaders of the churches should have become Baha'is. They didn't. Okay, we've got to struggle and do what we can. One thing that happened during this period, up to the 4-year plan, of course, was the large-scale conversion of people into the faith. It started, I think, in Africa, and then spread to the Pacific and Latin America and India. India was extremely rapid. And how to deal with that was a thing we had to learn. Isabel Sabri, was one of the counselors at the International Teaching Center, and she was a pioneer to Africa. She first pioneered to Britain, and she was a pioneer to Britain, I remember, when I became a Baha'i. And she married Hassan Sabri, and they pioneered to Africa. And she was on pilgrimage, talking to the Guardian about the time that Uganda was having vast numbers of new Baha'is. And she was very worried because quite a large number of these new Baha'is left the faith again. And she said this to the Guardian, what are we going to do? And he says, don't worry. He says, the time will come when people will flow in and out of the faith like a tide. The essential thing is never close the doors. In other words, we should accept that some people, it isn't that the ones who take a long time to accept the faith are necessarily deeper than the ones who accept them in 2 days. It's just that different people react in different ways. And people change their minds, and they're free to change their minds. So we should welcome people. I mean, we don't want to be stupid and say, can you say Baha'u'llah, Baha'u'llah, all right, you're a Baha'i. That's ridiculous. But we should understand when people say they really do believe, that we should accept them and try and integrate them into the community and not be worried that some should then go out again. That's their right. But we have to know how to consolidate the community as it grows. And this is the big difficulty. Isabel said one day it was rather like water going into the desert, because the pioneers would teach a number of Baha'is, who would teach a lot of other Baha'is, who would teach a lot of other Baha'is, and each stage knew less and less and less about the faith. And so you ended up with communities that called themselves Baha'is but knew virtually nothing about the faith, and therefore their lives as communities didn't change. And people would say, well, what are we Baha'is for? It's the same as it was before. That was some of the reactions. On the other hand, in some cases, the conversion was surprisingly profound. There's a story even in Sweden of, there was a newspaper notice about an unusual man living in a certain area who fasted every year. And as I said, when he fasted in the spring, the Baha'is were interested in this and got in touch with him. And he was thrilled to bits to learn the Baha'is in Sweden. He had become a Baha'i when he worked in Chicago at the time of the building of the temple. And he'd gone back to Sweden, and there were, as far as he knew, no Baha'is in Sweden. And for all these years, all he really knew about the faith was its greeting was Allahu Akbar, that they had prayers, and there was a fast once a year. And he faithfully kept the fast all those years, knowing he was a Baha'i without knowing anything more about the faith. And every now and again you'll find a community like that which accepts the faith, gets the essence. In other words, Baha'u'llah is the manifestation of God for this age and I'm his follower. And they'll stay like that for years and years until someone gets in touch with the poor soul and they come into the community. So there are people who will cling on like this, but most human beings, if they can't do anything with the belief they've got, tend to wander off into other activities. So the great thing that communities have to learn is how to simultaneously teach the faith, consolidate the faith of the new believers, and bring them into the workforce of the community. So that new believers aren't a burden, they're an added strength. And this is really what started in the four-year plan. The 12-month plan, which followed that, was to bring into the community's understanding the vital importance of the education of children. So many communities have lost whole generations of children, partly through a misunderstanding. We know very well that nobody should just follow blindly the religion of their fathers. This is, Abdu'l-Baha says this again and again. That's true. But it doesn't mean to say that parents should not teach their children the faith. Parents surely teach their children all the truth they possibly can. Why would one hold back from one's children the most important truth you know? Now, the way you teach the children, the way one encourages the children to think for themselves, to understand, to question what you're telling them, to really understand the faith, this is vital. But it isn't indoctrination to teach one's children the faith. It's giving them the truth that one has. And sooner or later, as you know, about the age of 15, the children have the responsibility to take the burden on their own shoulders. And then, some do, some don't. And we should continue with the connection with the children. I mean, simply because children don't become Baha'is doesn't mean they aren't our children anymore. And you can't break these links. There's all sorts of links one establishes in life which remain. I remember talking once to a mother whose daughter had been married, and they had a child, and then they were divorced. And the former husband of the girl said to the grandmother one day that they were no longer related. He wasn't divorced. He said, "What do you mean we're no longer related?" He said, "That's your daughter, isn't it? The little baby." He says, "Yes." "Well, it's my granddaughter. Marriage is broken, but not the fact that your daughter is my granddaughter." So in life you build up connections which just can't get severed. There are relationships, and there should be one thing about one's family, I think, is a blessing, is that one never really loses touch with one's family. People you meet in the street and you talk about the faith to, you may never see them again. But thank God our family is somewhere around, so it's never too late. One has this link with the family, one's extended family. But this business of teaching the children is so very important. The House of Justice had this whole 12-month plan concentrating on the teaching of children before it moved into the first 5-year plan. Now, the revelation of Baha'u'llah, of course, is for the whole of humanity. It's not our religion. And it's our responsibility to share it with mankind and to use the teachings as well as we can in our participation in the troubles and activities of mankind. The persecutions in Iran, which suddenly burst out with such renewed vigor in 1979, produced a tremendous education of the national spiritual assemblies around the world. People who had no skill in diplomatic work, probably just ordinary citizens going about their business, suddenly found that the House of Justice said, please go and see the Prime Minister and say so and so and so and so. This was very difficult for a lot of friends. They had to screw up their courage to do this sort of thing. But they did it. They struggled, they prayed. And there's a story which I've often told, I hope you haven't all heard it too often. But it's reliance on Baha'u'llah that helps Baha'is do things that we think are impossible. There was this story I'm telling you, there was a case when the House of Justice wanted a letter to be got into the hands of I think it was the president of an Arab country who was visiting Europe. And it asked a National Assembly to get a letter sent by the House of Justice into the hands of the ambassador of that country to give to the president when he was in Europe. So the Secretary of the Assembly had this letter which the House had sent, and he got in touch with the embassy of this country and asked if he could have an interview with the ambassador to hand over a letter. And they said, yes, most certainly, we'll arrange that. And nothing happened. He reminded them, and they said, well, they haven't been able to do anything quite yet, but. And he reminded them again, still nothing was happening. And so he realized it's the usual deal, nothing was going to happen. So he thought to himself, what is it that I haven't done that I could do? And he said, well, I'm at the national office, which is not in the capital. I could at least go to the capital to be where the embassy is. Now, this, you see, is, you might say, a decision of principle that there is something more you can do, and you can do it. It wasn't really a sensible decision, because if the embassy was going to contact anywhere, it would contact the National Assembly office. But he felt that was something he could do. So he went to the capital, and as he was approaching the gate to the embassy, a lady came from the other side, and he stepped back to allow her to go through the gate first. And she said, thank you very much. Is there some way I can help you? And he said, well, actually, yes, I have a letter I have to give to the ambassador. He said, oh, well, come with me, I'm his secretary. Now, you see, this is where practicality and faith interlink. That there are things that we know we have to do, and we think we're incompetent, and we can't do it. If we pick ourselves up and start to do it, that's when Baha'u'llah comes in and does things. I remember the hand of the cause, Paul Haney, saying once that he had this often when he was given tasks by the House of Justice. He was the hand who often used to go to visit the officials in Jerusalem. He was very useful, actually. He's a very tall man. So if it was a big gathering, I remember I went with him on at least one occasion to a presidential reception. And we were all gathered round, crammed in this room. And he wanted to know when the president came in. The president wasn't such a big man. And Paul was like a periscope above everybody else. And so as soon as he saw the president enter the room, he'd say, come with me, you see, and he'd come across and he'd see the president. Anyway, so he was used to going to deal with officials. And but he said once, time and again, the House of Justice would ask him to undertake a particular job. He couldn't see the wisdom of doing this. And he wasn't quite sure it was the right thing to do anyway, I mean, from a personal point of view. But the House of Justice had said, do it. So he said he would begin to do it. As he worked at it, door after door would open in front of him. And it would be fine, and he would go and do it. But if he just thought of all the problems, not, well, I can't really do it, and how else can we manage things, it would never have got done. So it's this combination of trust in Baha'u'llah, reliance on him, and using our own good thinking machinery to do what we think is best that will help the faith. So this involvement of the National Assemblies, of course, has a tremendous effect on the relationship of the faith to the public generally. There's a lovely thing happened in America. Again, I may have told you, I hope not. My memory is so bad I tell you things several times. In Washington, there were Baha'is who happened to overhear two members of the State Department talking to one another. And the matter at issue was a report of something was happening in Iran. And they weren't quite sure whether this report could be relied on or not. And one of the State Department people said to the other one, have you checked with Wilmette? Now, this is extraordinary. The faith is a very small thing in America in a sense, but you see the intimacy. Two things. One is, if Wilmette said it's okay, it's okay. And that's the reputation we establish. The other is that the faith is so well known that one State Department member could refer to another, speak to another about Wilmette. Not the headquarters of the Baha'is in Chicago, but just Wilmette, and you know what they're talking about. This is a tremendous step forward. Another one, I'm told, is that when the faith becomes the subject of cartoons and newspapers, then we've really got there. Part of the success of the faith, particularly in relation to the United Nations, has been the uniqueness of the Baha'i response to persecution. Because we aren't the only people in the world being persecuted. There are millions and millions of them. I've got the right ears. In the book it mentions that here. He says, the 20th century has, alas, been overwhelmed by the suffering of countless victims of oppression. What made the Baha'i situation unique was the attitude adopted by those who endured the suffering. The Iranian believers refused to accept the all too familiar role of victims. Like the founders of the faith before them, they took moral charge of the great issue between them and their adversaries. It was they, not revolutionary courts or revolutionary guards, who quickly set the terms of the encounter. And this extraordinary achievement affected not only the hearts, but the minds of those who observed the situation from outside the Baha'i faith. The persecuted community neither attacked its oppressors, nor sought political advantage from the crisis. Nor did its Baha'i defenders in other lands call for the dismantling of the Iranian constitution, much less for revenge. All demanded only justice, the recognition of the rights guaranteed by the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, endorsed by the Community of Nations, ratified by the Iranian government, and many of them embodied even in clauses of the Islamic constitution. So this dignity and self-confidence and lack of vengefulness is an incredible thing you find in the Baha'i case, and it has had a profound effect, particularly on the United Nations. We've shown how the Human Rights Commission and its various agencies can work. Now this strengthened the Human Rights Commission, and there were other things happened in the world which greatly strengthened the public situation of the faith. One was in Germany. Yes, so two outstanding examples suggest the character and importance of these advances. The first was achieved by the National Spiritual Assembly of Germany, where the nature of Baha'i elected bodies had been challenged by local authorities as being technically incompatible with the requirements of German civil law. Now, what they were saying was that you cannot have one institution, namely a local spiritual assembly, under the authority of another incorporated institution in Germany. You can't have one company under the authority of another, and therefore the Baha'i constitution is unacceptable. And they were going to disincorporate the local assembly of Tübingen. In upholding the appeal of the local spiritual assembly of the Baha'is of Tübingen against this ruling, Germany's constitutional high court concluded that the Baha'i administrative order is an integral feature of the faith, and as such is inseparable from Baha'i belief. The High Court justified its taking jurisdiction in the case by adducing evidence that the Baha'i faith itself is a religion, a judgment with far-reaching implications in a society where church opponents have long sought to misrepresent the cause as a cult or sect. You see, there's a principle in German law that divine law supersedes civil law. I think they've got this for years because of the Catholic Church and the Protestant Church there. The definitive language of the judgment merits repetition. And this is the background to its decision which the Supreme Court adduced. He says, the character of the Baha'i faith as a religion and of the Baha'i community as a religious community is evident in actual everyday life, in cultural tradition, and in the understanding of the general public, as well as of the science of comparative religion. That's one thing after another. So if anybody says, oh, you're not really an independent religion, here we have a decision of the German Federal Constitutional Court producing all these evidences. And then they said it was left to the Brazilian Baha'i community to win a victory on the field of external affairs that is so far unique in Baha'i history. On 28 May 1992, its country's highest legislative body, the Chamber of Deputies, held a special session to pay tribute to Baha'u'llah on the centenary of his ascension. The speaker read a message from the Universal House of Justice, and representatives of all the parties arose, one by one, to acknowledge the contribution to human betterment of the faith and its founder. A moving address by one prominent deputy described the Baha'i teachings as, quote, the most colossal religious work ever written by the pen of a single man. That is the Federal Parliament of Brazil. And Brazil is quite a country. Now, so these things have been happening in this part of the development of the faith. And I'm mentioning them because one tends to forget these sometimes. And they are very, very important in understanding the rise of the Baha'i administrative order in relation to the problems of the world. At the time of the, do you remember at the end of the century there was a Millennium Assembly held by the United Nations. There were a number of Millennium things organized by the United Nations. And yes, it says the changes wrought in humanity's social and moral life received powerful endorsement as a series of international gatherings called under United Nations authority to mark the approaching end of one millennium and the beginning of a new one. On the 22nd, 26th May 2000, representatives of over 1,000 non-governmental organizations assembled in New York at the invitation of Kofi Annan, the United Nations Secretary General. In the statement that emerged from this meeting, spokespersons of civil society committed their organizations to the ideal that, quote, we are one human family, in all our diversity, living on one common homeland, and sharing a just, sustainable, and peaceful world, guided by universal principles of democracy. So shortly afterwards, from 28 to 31 May 2000, a second gathering brought together leaders of most of the world's religious communities, likewise assembled at the United Nations headquarters. The Baha'i international community was represented by its Secretary General, who addressed one of the plenary sessions. No observer could fail to be struck by the call of the world's religious leaders, formally, for their communities to respect the right to freedom of religion, to seek reconciliation, and to engage in mutual forgiveness and healing. And yes, nothing so dramatically illustrates the difference between the world of 1900 and that of 2000 and the text of the summit resolution signed by all the participants and referred by them to the United Nations General Assembly. Quote, we solemnly reaffirm on this historic occasion that the United Nations is the indispensable common house of the entire human family, through which we will seek to realize our universal aspirations for peace, cooperation, and development. We therefore pledge our unstinting support for these common objectives and our determination to achieve them. And in concluding this sequence of historic meetings, Mr. Annan addressed himself to the assembled world leaders in surprisingly candid terms that, for many Baha'is, carried echoes of Baha'u'llah's stern admonition to the now vanished kings and emperors who had been these leaders' predecessors. Quote, it lies in your power, and therefore it is your responsibility to reach the goals that you have defined. Only you can determine whether the United Nations rises to the challenge. And that, for Kofi Annan, is pretty strong wording. the world as a whole and the media showed a cynical lack of interest to the whole of these events in the United Nations at the turn of the millennium. It really was something, they thought it was nice window dressing, nothing very important. But it was of fundamental importance. Somewhere. Sorry, I was going to quote something which I don't think I have anymore. Still, sorry. This is part of this whole procedure. Oh, here we are. Yes, this is it. Sorry, I leapt ahead too far. You remember when Abdu'l-Baha was in visiting Britain? He was invited to Edinburgh, and he stayed with the house of Mrs. White, who was the wife of, I think he was a moderator of the Church of Scotland. Any Scotsmen here who know that? Was it the Free Church or the Free Church of Scotland? Okay. There's so many different Presbyterian churches in Scotland, it gets quite bewildering. The very famous letter he wrote to her afterwards contains the matter of the 7 candles of unity. And I want to finish by reading this particular part because it gives us an insight into the process that's taking place. And Abdu'l-Baha wrote to Mrs. White, "O honoured lady, behold how that's unity's light, is now dawning upon the world's darkened horizons. The first candle is unity in the political realm, the early glimmerings of which can now be discerned. The second candle is unity of thought in world undertakings, the consummation of which will ere long be witnessed. The third candle is unity in freedom, which will surely come to pass. The fourth candle is unity in religion, which is the cornerstone of the foundation itself, and which, by the power of God, will be revealed in all its splendor. The fifth candle is the unity of nations, a unity which in this century will be securely established, causing all the peoples of the world to regard themselves as citizens of one common fatherland. The sixth candle is unity of races, making of all that dwell on earth peoples and kindreds of one race. The seventh candle is unity of language, i.e. the choice of a universal tongue in which all peoples will be instructed and converse. Each and every one of these will inevitably come to pass, inasmuch as the power of the kingdom of God will aid and assist in their realization." Now, there's a tendency sometimes to think of these as having to come in that order, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. That isn't so. And this book comments on the fulfillment of these, or the lighting of these candles, in a way that I think is very interesting. Remember, the House of Justice has confirmed that the unity of nations, a unity which in this century will be securely established, causing all the peoples of the world to regard themselves as citizens of one common fatherland, has been established. You just look at the world. This is not a matter of the unity of the states. The unity of states is a different thing. If something happens in China, or they have a tsunami in Indonesia, the whole world's upset and worried about it. Nothing happens in the world nowadays that gets in the news that people don't respond to as fellow human beings of the people affected. So now this has to improve. Everything happens gradually, but at least we got there in this century. Now he says, while it will be decades, or perhaps a great deal longer, before the vision contained in this remarkable document is fully realized, the essential features of what it promised are now established facts throughout the world. In several of the great changes envisioned, unity of race and unity of religion, the intent of the Master's words is clear, and the processes involved are far advanced, however great may be the resistance in some quarters. To a large extent, this is also true of unity of language. The need for it is now recognized on all sides, as reflected in the circumstances that have compelled the United Nations and much of the non-governmental community to adopt several official languages. Until a decision is taken by international agreement, the effect of such developments as the Internet, the management of air traffic, the development of technological vocabularies of various kinds, and universal education itself has been to make it possible, to some extent, for English to fill the gap. So that, in other words, whatever the government will eventually choose, so the governments of the world will have to choose something because it has to be taught in the schools of the world. That's why it isn't for the Baha'is to decide which is the international language. But in practice, nowadays in many areas it's English. I remember being particularly struck by the statement that when an Italian airliner is landing in Rome, the language between the airliner and the directing in Rome, it must be in English. You can't have lots of people talking different languages in airliners because it drives everyone crazy. And in the country we come from, Louise and I, Switzerland, in practical point of view, the National Assembly always consults in English. It's the only common language. One of the members is German speaking, he doesn't speak French or Italian. So the only way they can avoid translating is to all speak in English, which they all speak. So this is a movement of fact which is yet to be, shall we say, legalized. Now, unity of thought in world undertakings, a concept for which the most idealistic aspirations at the opening of the 20th century lacked even reference points, is also in large measure everywhere apparent in vast programs of social and economic development, humanitarian aid, and concern for protection of the environment of the planet and its oceans. As to unity in the political realm, Shoghi Effendi has explained that the reference is to unity which sovereign states achieve among themselves, a developing process at the present stage of which is the establishment of the United Nations. The Master's promise of unity of nations, on the other hand, looked forward to today's widespread acceptance among the peoples of the world of the fact that however great the differences among them may be, they are the inhabitants of a single global homeland. Unity and freedom has today, of course, become a universal aspiration of the Earth's inhabitants. Among the chief developments giving substance to it, the Master may well have had in mind the dramatic extinction of colonialism and the consequent rise of self-determination as a dominant feature of national identity at century's end. Whatever threats still hang over humanity's future, the world has been transformed by the events of the 20th century. That the features of the process should also have been described by the voice that predicted it with such confidence ought to command earnest reflection on the part of serious minds everywhere. Now, that isn't quite the end of the book, but it's basically the summary of the contents of this book. But I do urge you all, when you can get the time among all your other activities, to read through it, because, and also, if possible, when if you haven't already done it, read the Guardian's World Order letters, because when we understand what's happening in the world and the spiritual significance of what's happening, we get less distracted by the world's events from the tasks that we have to perform. The world can be a very worrying place, and there are some things that are ours to worry about and we can do something about. Ours we can't do anything about, and there's not much point in wasting our energy worrying about them. And we have to distinguish that and concentrate our efforts on the focus that the Universal House of Justice has given us. So thank you very much.
Thank you all very much.